Moral means and the Kantian kingdom of ends. Kant provides what might be considered either an alternative formulation or major implication of the categorical imperative. He says that according to the categorical imperative, we are to treat all rational beings as ends in themselves and never merely as a means to another end. This is a useful version of the categorical imperative that further facilitates its application in moral decision-making situations. The connections Kant draws are difficult to understand, but he emphasizes the unconditionality of the categorical imperative as a moral command that is supposed to be obeyed as an end in itself and not for any further reason or to achieve any further end. Since the categorical imperative is a rational principle, Kant argues that the categorical imperative presupposes that the rational will also exists as an end in itself and not merely as a means available to serve the purpose of achieving any other end. He explains, and we are still in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and it's now in yellow color in front of you. If then there is to be a supreme practical principle, and with respect to the human will, a categorical imperative, it must be one such that from the representation of what is necessarily an end for everyone, because it is an end in itself, it constitutes an objective principle of the will, and thus can serve as a universal practical law. The ground of this principle is rational nature exists as an end in itself. The human being necessarily represents his own existence in this way. So far, it is thus a subjective principle of human actions. But every other rational being also represents his existence in this way, consequent on just the same rational ground that also holds for me. Thus, it is at the same time an objective principle from which, as a supreme practical ground, it must be possible to derive all laws of the will. The practical imperative will therefore be the following. So act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. We shall see whether these can be carried out. And that's the second formulation in front of you. We said that there's only one categorical imperative, but that this categorical imperative have actually multiple manifestations. This is the second of three. Act that you use humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means. It is interesting to note that Kant does not try to explain why the assumption that rational beings are ends in themselves is the transcendental ground of the categorical imperative. In trying to reconstruct his reasoning, it appears he may have in mind the fact that only a rational being is capable of representing a rational principle and can only represent a principle as commanding a moral action by the rational will unconditionally as an end in itself if the rational will is itself an end in itself. Why this should be so is not entirely clear, but again, trying to fill in some of the blanks in Kant's reasoning suggests that perhaps it is because, by virtue of being capable of representing within itself a principle that requires obedience unconditionally as an end in itself, rather than merely as a means to another end, the will must itself be an end in itself rather than merely a means to any other end. It is as though the ability to represent such a principle automatically qualifies the rational will as an end in itself. The further implications of Kant's commitment to the rational will as an end in itself are very important in his moral theory. Kant argues, in particular, that we are morally obligated to treat all rational beings as ends in themselves and never merely as a means to another end. This implies that we cannot, under any circumstances, according to Kant, use other persons for any purpose without respecting them also as ends in themselves. What this moral injunction entails is in some way left indeterminate in Kant's discussions. The clear implication is nevertheless that we as moral agents are unconditionally morally obligated to treat all other rational beings as ends in themselves, morally valuable without qualification, regardless of whatever else they may do or however they might be useful to us. To give just one example, it would be morally wrong on Kant's interpretation of the categorical imperative under any circumstances to subject persons to experimental substances in order to discover what effects or side effects might result without their knowledge. Even under conditions of national emergency, when there is a pandemic or catastrophic threat to the welfare of other citizens, we show the requisite respect to such individuals by not involving them in dangerous situations against their will or without their voluntary participation and informed consent. Otherwise, we would just be using them as experimental subjects as means to another end. No matter how important, the point is they are not treated as ends in themselves. Kant introduces the concept of a kingdom of ends, where he explains a systematic union of all rational beings. The kingdom of ends in Kant's conception is an ideal that we as moral agents are unconditionally morally obligated by the categorical imperative to try to achieve. It is a moral state of affairs in which all rational beings treat one another with due moral respect, acknowledging one another as a deserving of moral treatment, and interacting in all things with regard for every person as an end in him or herself, and never merely instrumentally as a means to another end. If such an ideal can at all be achieved, in the actual personal relationships between all rational beings, then obviously there would be no lying, no theft, murder, treason, marital infidelity, war, or any other moral infractions that occur in transactions between persons. Kant thereby describes a long transition from individual, personal morality to an ideal social order with the extensive familial, legal, and political ramifications. Let's read this one in blue, and I'm here. For all rational beings, stand under the law that each of them is to treat himself and all others never merely as a means, but always at the same time as an end in themselves. But from these there arises a systematic union of rational beings through common objective laws that is a kingdom which can be called the kingdom of ends, admittedly only an ideal, because what these laws have as their purpose is just the relation of these beings to one another as ends and means. What makes the ideal social fabric a kingdom rather than a democracy in Kant's understanding is not merely his deep commitment to the monarchy or aristocracy personified in the Enlightenment Prince Frederick the Great of Prussia. The kingdom of ends is a kingdom more specifically and philosophically for Kant because he holds that within the interrelationships of persons who regard themselves and every other rational being as ends in themselves and not merely as a means to any other end, each person is a sovereign lawgiver. In effect, every rational being in the kingdom of ends is a king. The moral law that each king in the kingdom of ends legislates is not capriciously mandated like those of many ordinary kings in the popular sense. The kingdom of ends is one in which each person accepts, represents, and acknowledges the categorical imperative unconditionally as the moral law by which all rational beings are to live. Kant explains this one in the pink section just below. He says, a rational being belongs as a member to the kingdom of ends when he gives universal laws in it, but is also himself subject to these laws. That is the concept of a legislator and legislated. He belongs to it as sovereign when as law-giving he is not subject to the will of any other. A rational being must always regard himself as law-giving in a kingdom of ends possible through freedom of will, whether as a member or as a sovereign. The idea that each rational being as moral agent legislates the moral law to be followed in the kingdom of ends, and as such is a king among kings in the kingdom of ends, turns out to have deeper implications. Kant directs his attention at last from morality and the metaphysics of morals to the transcendental ground of the metaphysics at the deepest level of critical examination into the synthetic a priori presuppositions of ethics. The freedom that is assumed by the sovereign kingly participation of every rational moral agent in the Kantian kingdom of ends in Kant's inquiry is finally theorized by Kant at that as that which makes morals possible and without which moral judgment would be unthinkable. Kant claims that the sovereignty of each moral agent entering into the kingdom of ends by self-prescribing the universal moral law derives from the individual will freely choosing to follow the categorical imperative and abide by its implications in treating all rational beings as ends in themselves and never merely as a means to an end. Kant pursues the argument in a way that seems surprising until we actually pay attention at it in closer terms. Let's read this one again in pink. Morality consists then in the reference of all action to the law giving by which alone a kingdom of ends is possible. This law-giving must, however, be found in every rational being himself and be able to arise from his will, the principle of which is accordingly to do no action or any other maxim than one such that it would be consistent with it to be a universal law, and hence to act only so that the will could regard itself as at the same time giving universal law through its maxim. Now, if maxims are not already of their nature in agreement with this objective principle of rational beings as givers of universal law, the necessity of an action in accordance with this principle is called practical necessitation, that is duty. Duty does not apply to the sovereign in the kingdom of ends, but it does apply to every member of it, and indeed to all, in equal measure. Kant could hardly make a stronger statement of his basic conclusion in this part. He should be taken literally when he says that morality consists in the relation of all actions to that legislation through which the kingdom of ends is possible. The legislation Kant speaks of here is the rational will's law giving to itself of the unconditional universal moral law expressed in the categorical imperative. The idea of a kingdom of ends is thus made the sum total and philosophical analysis of the concept of morality. If we consider what is morally obligatory and morally forbidden, the perfect and imperfect moral duties unconditionally required by the categorical imperative, then there is a good case to be made in defense of Kant's conclusion that everything involved in morality is packed into the concept of the kingdom of ends. The kingdom of ends includes every moral duty of ourselves and others, from which the transcendental ground of moral philosophy and the metaphysics of morals can supposedly be deduced. As such, it is indispensable underlying condition for the possibility of all morality as the free law-giving sovereignty of each rational being participating as a moral agent in the Kantian kingdom of ends. This is the second formulation. We will now move to the third in the next video on moral autonomy and heteronomy. Please share, like, or subscribe to this YouTube channel, Samo't sa Simula, if this topic interests you. Thank you.